In 1555, to commemorate his victory, Ivan commissions a building that would become the most recognizable symbol of the Russian Empire. Today it's known as St. Basil's Cathedral.
The Cathedral of the Intercession, which we know as St. Basil's, is based on the technology of brick towers that the Italians brought in and the Russians later adapted to create votive tower churches.
Constructed almost entirely of brick, the cathedral was actually 8 churches in one. It was laid out in a geometric pattern, with each church circling a central tower, symbolizing the 8 days of the siege of Kazan. In the 1580s, the cathedral's most distinctive feature was added.
The onion dome takes its form, its image from that flare that occurs at its base. It rests on a cylinder called a drum. And from that cylinder, the top of that cylinder, it flares out very sharply, rises up, and then culminates in a peak. That is the onion dome.
The onion domes on St. Basil's were completely unique. Each one was constructed of individually textured, hand-painted metal sheaths laid over an iron frame.
If you strip that metal sheath away, it would look something like a bird cage that had been squashed so that you got the flare.
The result was a stunning architectural feat never before seen in Russia. By 1553, Ivan's dominions were the largest in Europe, and he was at the height of his power. But his deepening paranoia and iron grip on the jugular of the nation were slowly strangling his empire. He launched a series of costly and foolish wars and sadistically struck out at anyone who opposed his power. The flames of Ivan's insanity were consuming his own people. And no one was safe, not even his own family.
Another reason Ivan IV could be called the Terrible is probably the finale of his reign when he murdered his son, who was trying to protect his pregnant wife from Ivan's rage.
Ivan had beaten the woman so severely that she miscarried. When his son confronted him, Ivan turned on him too. In a blinding rage, he struck out, killing him instantly. With one swift move, Ivan had destroyed his own line of succession. By the time of his death in 1584, the empire was in a shambles.
Soon after Ivan came the decade-long so-called time of troubles. A civil war combined with a war of foreign intervention. In the course of that, Muscovy, Russia, came very close to losing its independence.
Just 1 century after achieving independence, Russia was on the brink of disaster. But soon a Russian giant would appear on the world stage, stunning everyone by engineering a shining city in the middle of nowhere.
Ivan the Terrible married 7 times and even proposed to a lady in the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England.
1696. A new Tsar comes to power with a revolutionary plan to pick up where Ivan the Terrible left off and transform his backward nation into a modern empire. His name is Peter the Great.
Peter the Great was an absolutely unique person. A giant, both physically, 6.5 feet tall, as well as in terms of personality. He disregarded convention and tradition. He was endlessly curious about new things.
Peter's enormous size was matched by his ego.
A constant whirlwind of activity occurred around him, and he took on the tasks of a dozen men. He was really an extraordinary, larger-than-life person.
Peter had spent his early years in Moscow, carousing with artisans and military men in the city's foreign quarter, learning about their tactics and technology.
Peter was not only entranced with European technology, he was also very aware of Russia's backwardness and weakness vis-a-vis Europe. He wanted to remedy that situation.
So one of his first acts was he went to Europe, and he went to Europe incognito. And there he studied the craft of shipbuilding with the Dutch, who were masters at it. He also learned the art of navigation from the English Navy, and he saw the great wealth these European empires were pulling out of their overseas colonies, and he figured they might have use for Russian natural resources. But what Peter really wanted was a piece of the action. And he knew that in order to cut into the pie, he would have to drag his country kicking and screaming out of its gloomy medieval backwardness into the great white light of new commercialism of the Western world. When he got back to Russia, Peter resolved to transform his country into a naval force that would not only trade with the European empires, it would compete with them as a military power.
Peter sets his sights on a stretch of land 400 miles north of Moscow, near the Baltic Sea on the Neva River. With godlike vanity, he began envisioning a new naval city that would put Russia on Europe's map. He would call his vision St. Petersburg.
A city on that spot had direct maritime access to Europe.
The only problem was that this land on the Neva belonged to Sweden. Peter would not be deterred. In 1700, he launched an all-out attack and took the land by force. By 1703, the cornerstone of the city was laid.
The new capital that Peter had in mind, it was to be a fortress, was to be the center of the army and the navy. It was to be the window on Europe through which Western ideas, modern ideas were going to flood and spread throughout the entire empire.
Out of bloodshed and warfare, St. Petersburg was born. But for the people of Russia, their Tsar's ambition would prove to be a double-edged sword.
Peter chose the site of his future city for its access to the Baltic Sea, but this advantage would come with a steep price. For 5 months out of the year, the river delta and its surrounding swamps would freeze, and then predictably and reliably flood when they thawed with the warmer months. The building of this city would be a monumental challenge. So Peter turned to the one natural resource that compensated in Russia when all else failed: raw manpower.
The people of Russia would literally build St. Petersburg with their bare hands. Surrounded by nothing but swamp, supplies were almost impossible to come by. In order to raise the foundations of the fortress above tidewaters, workers had to dig piles of earth with their bare hands and then transport thousands of pounds of soil in their jackets and shirts. Everything had to be imported. Even lumber had to be cut upstream and floated down in huge quantities to stabilize the city's foundations.
There's no bedrock there, so that any large structure had to be built on pilings.
To do this, engineers designed a pulley system to drive thousands of piles into the soft earth.
You'd raise the head, and they would drop it, and that would drive the pile into the ground. And this was repeated tens of thousands of times in Petersburg.
Within 5 months, thousands and thousands of laborers had erected the hexagonal walls and the timber bastions of this fortress you see behind me. At night, they'd come home to their camps freezing and tired and hungry, and just as they had come by the thousands, so they would die by the thousands from disease, from the flooding, and from exhaustion. By 1708, a rough estimate of 25,000 laborers had perished building this fledgling city, which gave rise to its nickname, the City of Bones. There is no statistic that tells us exactly how many people died before this city was finished, but a 19th century historian says that up until that point, there was no single battle in the annals of military history that cost as many lives as the number of laborers who perished in the building of St. Petersburg.
For Peter, the human toll was merely a means to an end. In 1706, he launched his first warship from St. Petersburg Admiralty Shipyard. This was the city's first industrial compound. It housed shipbuilders, sail and rope makers, forges, and a cannon foundry. Russia now had a navy, and its Tsar was single-handedly changing the face of the empire. In 1712, with his usual brisk efficiency, he makes the biggest change of all. In a simple and stunning decree, Peter makes St. Petersburg the capital of Russia. In an instant, Moscow's nearly 300-year supremacy in Russia was over. The citizens of Moscow were stunned.
Many Russians reacted to Peter as though he were an alien from outer space. They didn't understand him. He imposed his strange ideas on his country using the full force of an autocratic and absolute monarch, which he inherited from his predecessors, but he knew very well how to use it to get his will.
His vision to revolutionize Russia was the thing that drove him throughout his life. Nothing and no one escaped some kind of an effect from this revolutionary process.
Peter had spared no expense to create a city from scratch. But by 1714, St. Petersburg was still a long way from being the European power center he envisioned. And Peter's years of hard living were about to catch up with him. Without his dogged will, the entire fantastic endeavor threatened to crumble, leaving Russia once again on the verge of chaos.
In 1698, Peter the Great issued a beard tax to be paid by anyone refusing to cut off their old-fashioned Russian beards in favor of a clean-shaven Western look.
For decades, Peter the Great had been monastically focused on his twofold task of turning Russia into a great empire and St. Petersburg into its glittering capital, with one exception. He still held his legendary bouts of drinking with his buddies, but as always, his hard partying had very little effect on his relentless energy. He defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War. He'd extended Russia's boundaries from the Baltic all the way to the Pacific. He built a new European capital. He built a navy. He built schools of engineering and science, and he'd increased Russian trade sevenfold. Military and politically, Russia had become an empire, but it still lacked the one element essential to all empires: prestige.
In 1714, Peter began sketching designs for a grand palace atop a 50-foot bluff overlooking the sea, 25 miles outside of St. Petersburg. He would call it Peterhof. The palace would be surrounded by over 600 acres of gardens and crowned by a gilded network of fountains running down the entire face of the bluff. Work on the monumental project began in 1716.
Large numbers of army soldiers were actually sent to the estate to dig the trenches that would feed the water through a pipe system to the fountains.
In 1719, the country's first hydraulic engineers began work on the intricate system.
The palace was built on the heights, and the heights are what feed the water. It's that drop, the gravity in that drop that actually powers the fountains.
Using the natural slope of the terrain and water from nearby springs, workers constructed a 14-mile gravity-fed system. The water was stored in upper reservoirs. In a flash, it was released to shoot through wooden pipes down a 50-foot cascade to the fountain's centerpiece. The speeding water accumulated enough force to shoot 65 feet into the air. The result was breathtaking. The fountains were so spectacular, they were dubbed Russia's Versailles. But Peter didn't have much time to enjoy his showpiece. In 1725, after wading into freezing water to save a drowning sailor, the great Peter took ill and died. By the end of his reign, Peter had taken Russia from a backward, isolated country to a state-of-the-art empire. But the job was far from done. It would be the ambitious and tenacious German wife of Peter's grandson who would complete St. Petersburg's transformation from a naval fort to the glittering capital we recognize today. Her name was Catherine the Great.
Catherine comes to power in the year 1762 by overthrowing her husband, who had been the Russian emperor for only 6 months. And she was able to quite easily topple him